Hi everyone.
Hi everyone.
What we have for you today is a seminar on From Trauma to Individuation. So we'll be outlining the way that we deal with trauma with a specific example to do with the military. It's a work-through example with contributions from some of our best students. But it also brings in the idea of individuation and how that can be the end process of working through trauma. And obviously, many of you out there will know and will recognize through your own personal experience that the way trauma is treated by so-called health professionals doesn't vary much off and away from mistreating people into re-experiencing trauma and being told to accept that they have something for the rest of their life. That's completely contrary to the way that we've practiced for the past 46 years. But what you'll get here is our view rather than that view, and see how you feel about it. Judge for yourself. And here's some of the accounts of our students, one of whom is a 25-year veteran of using therapy with traumatized patients.
Yeah, it's unconventional, but it works.
That's all that matters.
Yeah.
Okay, see you soon. Take care. Blessings, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.
Bye now. Hi, everyone. So what we have today is a look into the ancestral psyche and specifically how that affects trauma. So in order to do that, the first thing we need to appreciate is that we do actually have an ancestral psyche, and our psychology is not reducible into what we experience in our everyday life as the ego, or indeed to Jung's personal unconscious, which is made up of complexes, which are, of course, fields of association, learning, behavior, and even somatic and psychosocial expression. As important as they are, that doesn't really get us down to the foundations of the psyche at a biological level. But the ancestral psyche does, and through that we have the portal to the Platonic, which we've discussed in previous videos. So the example we're going to use today is post-traumatic stress disorder in the military. I have some experience of this working with UK and US forces, some of them special forces, and I've worked through these, I'll call them friends of mine because inevitably they did become friends at the level of engagement that I was involved with them. These friends of mine and of Pauline's have proven this approach directly, and this is with people who've suffered so much and been through the usual CBT or trauma-based therapies that are popular out there. But in principle, this works for any kind of dissociative trauma that affects anybody. And I would go back to Freud for the foundation of this with his trauma theory of neurosis. And Pierre Janet, of course, too, when he spoke about the dissociation of the psyche into sub-nuclear units of itself under pressure of trauma. So trauma and dissociation are part of the foundation of hypnosis, right the way back to Mesmer, but also into the 19th century when we saw the formal schools of hypnosis and psychotherapy being first formulated. So here we have then healing, archetype and trauma. And here we have the ancestral psyche portrayed by the cave art and by the presence of an ancestor of our representative soldier here, the contemporary soldier. That they look a little bit alike is pure coincidence. Although, of course, they will carry a considerable part of the same genome between them. So what was laid down for the Paleolithic human at a fundamental level is still present in our contemporary soldier. So let's begin our journey now. So here we have a representation of the ancestral psyche in 3 distinct layers. We'll start at the bottom with the young boys who are playing war games with toy guns. Now, of course, this is easy to dismiss as just being a phase that children go through. But what we're suggesting is that this is the acting out of the rehearsal of meta-instincts. That is to say, the anticipations that the genome has for the kinds of challenge that young men will start to face as they move into adolescence. The time that even in the Paleolithic, they would have been expected to bear a great deal of responsibility, far beyond the levels of responsibility that they would be expected of today. But the genome nevertheless anticipates it and rehearses it through the timed release urge and compulsion, indeed, at an instinctive level, to act out rehearsals, preparations for the future. Hence, we have the DNA strands in the brain to suggest that this is hardwired into the brain because it is in the DNA and in the associated fields of the genome. The first level of fantasy, I'll call it that because that's the ordinary term that's used for such things, that these young boys are likely to be experiencing is copying the soldiers, the military, the contemporary military. But those soldiers themselves are acting out patterns, as we say, were laid down in the Paleolithic. So the ancestral psyche is present, and it's largely disguised by contemporary representations such as those of the military. But the young boys are still nevertheless acting out in a superpositioned way every possible layer of representation that goes all the way back from their anticipations personally, through the culture into which they are born, the historical time period into which they were born, right the way back again to the Paleolithic. These are very, very powerful determining factors. In fact, Jung originally called archetypes dominants. These were dominant fields as we would understand them today for the organization of the anticipation of inheritance at a biological level. And here we see this acted out in a contemporary urban street scene. So, for the benefit of viewers then, would anybody like to offer any kind of observation at this stage?
Hi, Steve. Yes.
I
The two things that really stand out to me about this, one is that the playfulness of the young boys is actually rehearsal, as opposed to just boys do what boys do. And I think um, the rehearsal part of it, you know, again, we've talked in the in the past classes about the future casts a shadow backwards to the present, and then it seems to fit with that theme. And then it's also the other thing that stands out to me is that it's hardwired, and I think culture, at least in my observation, seems to want to mess with what is already hardwired, and there's so much in the current zeitgeist that is contradictory, and people are, in some ways, at least intellectually at war with each other over what is and what isn't hardwired. So I really appreciate those two elements of what you just shared.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Yeah, the hardwiring element is an interesting angle, and another area where this is denied for contemporary young men has to do with their identity, biologically and sexually, as being male. And I would say this again goes all the way back to the foundation of modern psychotherapy. Freud's notion of psychosexual development, and even of the Oedipus complex and the superego or superego, is also hardwired, anticipated, and on timed release. Now, he more or less fixed himself, as we all know, into that because that's what he was meeting in his adult patients in Vienna in the 1890s. He met with frustrated sexual instincts and frustrated instincts for violence. And there is a level of argument to say that where people are not cultured into receiving these timed released mechanisms, then we're going to get neurotic disturbances at best. And I would say that this is proof that Freud was onto something. I don't think his ideas were anything like complete enough, but he was definitely onto something, even in focusing on psychosexual development. And that is not to say, of course, that there is an Oedipus complex, but there is an Oedipal situation that we could describe more broadly to talk about how a young boy receives initial confirmation from his mother to be a male of the species and different from her. Part of the preparation for the boy becoming an adult will be seeing his father through different lenses, different experiences, and receiving an imprint of his own sense of identity and masculinity through his relationship to him. And that initially rehearses all of the psychosocial relationships that involve authority beyond the family. So that is the culture more generally. And for Freud, the solution to the Oedipal situation was the development of the superego. In other words, a functional conscious or conscience, a conscience which would set boundaries on what was allowable in a culture for the id, which is his term for instinct. But again, unfortunately, most of the instincts that he was experiencing in people that were causing neurosis were negative. So there is a time release development, and an understanding of play has been addressed by psychoanalysts. Less so by Jung, oddly perhaps, because he was very interested in how adults play in an attempt to correct for what went wrong for them when they were young, but he quite openly left the early stages of child development to Freud while still criticizing Freud at the same time. He didn't really offer a full enough alternative. And we have play therapy as an aspect of Melanie Klein's work, along with object relations, of course, and the attachment theorists. And where there is some superficial acknowledgement of biological development in those models, in our view, they don't address them properly in context because they collapse into a contemporary context, as if we have to settle for that. Now, as if the genome will agree with us settling for that, which is a form of overriding the ancestral psyche according to the current zeitgeist, exactly the kind of thing that you've been describing. And of course, this rather catabolic with respect to biological developments zeitgeist that we live in at the moment is, as you say, determined to take these things off young boys, take away the preparation that they have for realizing the anticipation of the genome to become men and to adapt in a way that the genome has always agreed with, always recognized, and always prepared young boys for. And I say that without moral judgment about what that configuration actually is in application. But it should be clear from Freud alone that if we frustrate instincts, then that brings about a compensation in extremis. There is an extreme reaction in a healthy individual to being repressed in that way with respect to the psyche. It should be men who control men. It should be men who offer them an understanding of what is appropriate, where the boundaries are. And for that to happen, a young boy needs to understand what it is to be a man in waiting, as I say, through relationship to his father, then his peer group, as in the example here, and then into the wider authority that Freud understood in terms of being the superego. Now that brings about its own problems, of course, because a very punishing and constricting superego is also another cause of neurotic conflict and maladaptation. So it's not easy to adapt, but it seems it's very easy to receive. Given a chance, these young boys will do this or something similar. Yes, according to the culture within which they live and the historical time period within which they live. A few centuries before this, there wouldn't have been guns, certainly not like that. But young boys also play with sticks. They play with makeshift spears. They also play with bows and arrows as well. These representations, it seems now, initially it would have been through epigenetics, then it would have been through a modification of the Platonic and Sheldrakean fields associated with the genome. They've become incorporated representationally. And young boys will play with sticks as if they were Paleolithic spears or they were medieval knights. They'll play with bows and arrows as if they were Paleolithic hunter-gatherers or as if they were medieval English longbowmen fighting the French at Agincourt in 1415. Or in the United States, they may even adopt the role of being indigenous tribes people resisting the intrusion of the Europeans by using bows and arrows. Whatever it it's easiest for them under instinctive and Platonic pressure at any one moment to represent from the culture and from their education and understanding of history how to shape these ancient pressures. But what does it really say? Well, we've covered this. This is a preparation for those young boys to become soldiers. And we should know from the experience of the Second World War and even some of the earlier larger wars, where the mobilization of an entire population, what was called in the Second World War total war, requires the ancestral psyche to be mobilized in the whole population. This has been the experience for women in the 20th century and the two largest wars of the 20th century as well. They were appropriated to the need to draw ancestral instincts into an appropriate context. So again, this is hardwired even for women under difficult conditions where that is forced upon them. Where it's not forced upon them and other instinctive needs are met. This is true for everybody, but for a moment, I'd like to focus on women. But when that happens, then there's a kind of a luxury state that they occupy where an awful lot of instinctive needs are met indirectly, but it doesn't remove instinctive pressure from them. And that would predictably mean, following on from Freud and just about all of the major early psychologists, psychodynamic and otherwise, would mean that frustrated instincts start to take on a different form. And we could bring in the Freud-Adler-Jung equation here, but I'm counting that everybody who watches this video will have some understanding of that. So therefore, we could expect, and I'll call it this in blunt terms, a corruption of fundamental instincts brought about by the fact that a great deal has been met or provided for them, but suddenly they're thrown into a state where they have to receive the ancestral psyche in a particular way, what Freud would have called the cathexis of libido or of instinct. So, as I say, that happened certainly in Europe and in the Far East during the Second World War, where there was total mobilization of the population, male and female, and very, very fundamental Freudian and Adlerian patterns of adaptation to biological stress came to the fore. There was far less of the classical Jungian understanding of what archetypes are. They were there, but they were completely enveloped by instinct and by collective ancestral instinct at that, where the population was mobilized towards a particular goal. And what this should tell us is that that is latent. And if the circumstances call upon for those latent instincts to manifest themselves, then they will. And where we're at the moment is an artificial collapse and a neurotic division at the cultural level that separates particularly young boys off from their identity. But it doesn't stop them. They will find another way. Even if, sadly, that other way is that they become neurotic and maladapted. A solution for that is to go into the military, even though the military has also been shifted in the West towards being woke. We're not seeing that in cultures that are not, in a global sense, pan-European in origin. That's not happening. It's not even happening in Russia. Although Russia during the Second World War did mobilize the female population, there were a lot of female soldiers who fought in the front line. That was handled by the ideologies of Marxism at the time in the context of the Second World War. And that's different. Although there are females in the military and they are moving into frontline roles, there isn't the same pressure yet on the West that there was, say, on the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Everything I've said is controversial according to the current zeitgeist. I appreciate that and expect the consequences of that, because that's the culture within which we are expressing these ideas and observations. But we can see that the catabolism is neutering young men now, so they will not be prepared to go into the military. It won't be a good idea for a lot of young men to actually do this because of the feminization of the culture of the military. And that will be resisted then by those instincts. And the thing is, where will they go? They will not go away. They will be there. Some of them will shift into adapting to the zeitgeist of woke. And as we've covered in previous videos, that will lead to a certain kind of semi-feminized masculinity that will still carry Darwinian adaptations with it. It'll just adjust. That doesn't bode well for the long-term survival and maintenance of a culture or of a breeding population, but it will be an adaptive phase, and it is underway now. And I would argue it's been underway since the 1980s, but it's particularly bad in the West at the moment. But the meta instincts don't go away. They're still there, and they will still push. So what that would predict, and this is retrospective prediction, is that the Freud-Adler-Jung equation will mobilize itself. So the frustrations of Freud will appear at the level of Adler in a disguised way. Hence, Freud seeks Adler, and Adler conceals Freud. Adler is all about adaptation to culture, adaptation of Freud. The Jungian elements in woke culture is where ideology comes in, and then the inflation of that ideology and the effect that has upstream of itself on the expression of Adler and of Freud. And at that level, it's obvious that we're seeing a massive division within the culture. There are those who adapt to it. I'm speaking about men now. Those who adapt to it opportunistically, and there are those who resist it. And of those who resist it, quite a large proportion of them will give up at the Freudian level. And we're seeing that now. That's out there. It's in the internet. It's part of the progression, unfortunately, the way that the culture is going. But there will be others who will seek escape into the military. And that's at the level of the collective. But where the ancestral psyche collapses into the individual level, at the Adlerian level of development, in other words, at the level of politicians, then Adler will be very, very blurred with Jung because of ideology, political ideology. And as we've discussed in recent videos, the inflation then of the political leaders would predictably go to the point of a corruption of Jung into extreme inflationary pathology. But it does not escape biology by doing that. It forces biology to utilize the inflation to correct for itself. And that is the great danger with respect, as we've said recently, into bringing about the potential for a third world war and the collapse of the population. So there's some of the issues that can go wrong if we don't handle that which is hardwired appropriately. And when I was young, and I'm talking about 1950s and 60s, when I was a young boy, we lived in the literal cultural shadow of the Second World War. And it was everywhere. It was represented in toys, in games, in movies. And it was what our parents went through, just as our grandparents went through the First World War. We could not escape that. But there was a compensation, and that came through in the culture in the form of counterculture, the hippies and the like. And whereas there was a lot that was positive in that, it was really quite clear that that was an extreme compensation for the adaptation that our parents and grandparents made to what they went through. And what followed that, unfortunately, is what we've got now. Another compensation. If we don't handle the compensation adequately, then something else will take over, which will default down to Freud with a very, very harsh level of natural selection aimed at a given population. And as I say, that's where the Freud-Adler-Jung equation kicks in. But our view is that there is a golden mean, there is a point which is attainable at which a culture regulates itself appropriately. And the ancestral psyche, in this case for young boys, being prepared to be the successors to their Paleolithic ancestors, that can be put into a context that satisfies that and allows other meta instincts that are more positive in many ways to come through and to be actualized in the world. But the minute the the boys are collectively neutered with respect to their identity and the instinctive and meta-instinctive pressures that they are feeling through their developmental biology. The minute that happens, everything downstream of that is negatively affected, and culture will begin to damage itself because it's gone too far. It's gone past the golden mean. So in that regard, then, this is what we have here. We have the preparation that is already being affected within the culture within which they live. They may be lucky, they may have parents who are open and understanding of that, but the wider culture, which will take on the representational form of Freud's superego, delivered largely by women. Again, a controversial thing to say, but the influence of women that comes through woke culture will take on the cast of the superego for these young boys as they go through adolescence and start to tackle the adaptive problems of the first half of life, which Jung said himself were completely to be answered by Freud and Adler. If the feminine is already interfering with the adaptation of the masculine before adolescence is resolved, then we should expect to see a huge spike in neurosis. It is what we're seeing at an individual and a cultural level. So this is the first problem. This is the first adaptive problem. What do young boys do about instinctive pressure, even where they are allowed to act it out to this extent representationally? And I had loads of friends, obviously, I mean, boomers did. There was a lot of us because the biological drive was to replace the population, largely men who had been killed in the Second World War. So the women in our parents' generation were under instinctive pressure to increase the population. So there were a lot of us. And I can confidently say that all of my friends went through this adaptive phase, but not all of them went into the military. So left alone, there will be self-selection. But it's as if they're all being stopped, they're all being misdirected, they're all having their instincts, their natural instincts, perfected into the wrong representations, which attack them at the level of their identity fundamentally. So that level of self-selection, which has been operating probably in the same distribution curve as it always has right back to the Paleolithic, has been interfered with. So we're left with the unfortunate stresses that the present young generation and the one behind them that's up and coming are being exposed to. As I say, it doesn't remove it, because Freud seeks Adler. Those instincts will seek power. Adler conceals Freud because Adler will adjust the context, which is the meta-instinctive expression of Freud, in order to at least satisfy some of it through a flexibility of adaptation. And as I say, that's what we're seeing with some of these feminized young men. That's an adaptive strategy. They haven't gotten rid of him. They haven't exorcised Freud. Adler has merely concealed him in another way. Adaptive in the short term, but not in the long term. So that's the situation as we see it, being as objective as we can, bearing in mind the vast number of people that Paul and I have seen individually and together in the past 46 years. That is long enough to see trends, adaptive trends occurring for each generation. And it's not a generation or two, it's the numbers of people in each generation as they meet these demands and challenges and then adapt over the span of that generation. So we can see the trends, we've experienced it. And from the point of view of the survival of the West and its own self-correction, it's been negative overall. So this is a hugely important thing that we should address. What happens to instincts when they are suppressed? Fundamental instincts. You can guide them into symbolic representation without expressing them fully, without acting them out. It doesn't need to lead to the militarization of every young boy in the West, because that wouldn't happen anyway. Only in the extreme example of total war, which I mentioned earlier, would that be called upon. And even then, there'll be some who won't want to do that. who aren't drawn to that. They'll find other ways. Maybe they'll become medics. Perhaps they will become religious people. Military priests. They have a role to play, because in extremis of the expression of meta instincts, you then get religious expressions of transcendent meaning and understanding, which is necessary to compensate and to some extent to reduce the impact of extreme sacrifice under such conditions. So Jung will take on that role then in that specific context. But when society is not allowed to self-regulate, then biology is frustrated, and then we get the results that's following on from this now. So what's happening in the West towards the Middle East and towards the polarization with the Far East, including the Far East of Europe, shows what goes wrong when a culture starts to destroy itself by not utilizing meta instincts properly. Wherever we might think of what goes on in China, and worse still in North Korea, they certainly know how to mobilize a population collectively. They do understand meta instincts enough to direct a population into mass mobilization. And they also understand the self-interest of a localized reproductive gene pool competitively at the level of Darwin. And other than that, the East is patient. It's prepared to wait. The Chinese psyche collectively is like that. They are prepared to see what we might see in decades or perhaps a century or two, they see in terms of millennia. So the passage of time for them can be slow because they have the longer view. And why interrupt the West if it's busy destroying itself? And I'm speaking now at a Darwinian level from the perspective of another culture. It is Darwinian. And we really do need to wake up to that, because if we don't access that, we don't get rid of it. In fact, it starts to run everything. Because even Plato, at a higher register of consciousness, cannot deliver itself unless Darwin is appropriately applied and regulated at the collective level. Darwin is the efficient cause of those circumstances that allow Plato at a collective level to instantiate within individuals. There are individuals, of course, who can instantiate Plato directly, but there aren't many who do. To increase those numbers, though, we need, as Jung himself said, to be able to deal with Freud and with Arber appropriately before we can receive Plato under normal conditions. Otherwise, when Plato does ingress, it will do so autonomously, without direct conscious relationship with the individual who receives a transpersonal insight into themselves and into the meaning of life. So I'll pause on that one, and I'm sorry there was a lot of information given there, but there is so much in that image that we really need to understand before we progress. Unless you'd like to bring anything in first, Paul?
Well, I would say that street scene that we're looking at there, that's very familiar to you and I from our childhoods. But you very, very rarely see that these days. You very rarely see groups of young boys like that going out with toy guns. I mean, one of the young guys there looks like he's got a water gun rather than something resembling, the real thing. So you might see that, but you probably certainly wouldn't see the other three young boys with the various guns that they have there, and yet it was so common for us.
It was, wasn't it?
And I think your point about the repression of instinct is absolutely spot on, because it doesn't go away. And if those young boys are not allowed to play in that overt way with guns, they will find other ways of expressing those instinctive drives through, as I think you've already said, pick up a stick and use it as a spear, or they might have a pretend bow and arrow, or something else will replace it. And if they grew up in a family that is intolerant even of those kinds of things, then they might find themselves playing video games for hours on end in their own bedroom.
Yeah.
But, the point is that if young boys are allowed to play symbolically in this way, it doesn't turn them all into
Yeah.
killers, which I think has been I think there's been the mistaken understanding that if young boys are allowed to do that, then that will be the outcome. And again, as I think you've emphasized, Steve, that's very much to do with the way that things have progressed over the decades, the gradual feminization of the West. And I mean, I've seen it even within my own family with my nephew, where my sister actively discouraged him, wouldn't buy guns for him actually, it went that far. Um, and we're talking some time ago now, we're talking early 90s. But I think what was even more alarming than that, because maybe you could understand a mother having that perspective more than the father took an even harder line than the mother on it. He was absolutely, totally against young boys playing with guns. And the amount of repression of instinct in that household was significant.
Yeah.
And damaging as well, to that young boy growing up. So we've seen it within the context of our own family. And on a sort of a meta-regulatory scale of it, if we're talking about nation states as opposed to individual families, well, again, as you said, Steve, that instinct has to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And we're seeing an increase, not in the West necessarily, but in other cultures where they wouldn't tolerate that kind of thing. The idea of war, and young boys acting out war in this way, is actively encouraged. And so ultimately that will lead to a more vigorous population,
Yeah.
in an aggressive sense of young men. And in some of those cultures, without specifying them, the women will be, they will be dressed in a particular way and they will be handed guns themselves with no bullets in them, which is almost like a kind of a symbolic gesture, I think, to say that they're there to support the men.
Yeah.
Rather than actively going to war in that way, hence there's no bullets in the guns. And they understand that within the context of their own culture.
Yeah.
But this is part of the compensation, as you say, these compensations that occur throughout history, we appear to not be learning from. I mean, there was an earlier one too in the 20s, the so-called Roaring Twenties, which just resulted in hedonism and degradation amongst young people. And that was juxtaposed with the loss of life in the previous generation, that actually went to war. And some of those young people wouldn't have been much older than the generation that came after them, and basically lived it up, and didn't care about indulging themselves to the full. You have that kind of contrast in experience as well when you look back in time over the various decades, and it really is as if we've not learned from history. Well, I mean, it has to keep repeating itself in this way for us to get the message.
And it will.
And it will.
Yeah.
Well, it is coming again, unfortunately, isn't it? We're in that position now because of the repression of masculinity,
Yeah.
globally, really. And it's we're living with the consequences of that.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Just to put the your nephew into some context with respect to his father.
Yeah.
His father was born in 1938, so he was a child during the Second World War. And he would fantasize that he would be, or was in some cases, a Royal Air Force fighter pilot. And I mean fantasize as an adult, not as a child.
Yeah.
He had a private pilot's license for a light aircraft. And he would go to air shows and he would take RAF badges and leave them visible inside his car, as if to suggest he was in the RAF or had been, and he never was. Now, he had those fantasies, which were somehow probably containing these instincts for him, but at the same time, he agreed with your sister, his wife, about how they should treat the son, and there's an immediate neurosis. I mean, in the house there would be big paintings of bombers from the RAF Bomber Command. There would be Spitfires up there from the Battle of Britain and so forth. All of these images that his father aspired to but had never done, he was nevertheless agreeing with his wife's suppression of them in their son. And she would forcibly, I've witnessed this, because they actually acted this out in our home, drag your nephew to the ground. This is the mother, your sister, physically restrain him because of his frustration and sit on him. And it was like something out of the UFC. And this was with a young child who could only express frustration that way because every other opportunity was taken from him, and subsequently became very, very attached to her in the wrong way. So that's not the only example that we can give, obviously, because that was a social family example. But there are wider ones, and it's been going on for some time. So a neurotic attitude in a father towards a son about representations of instincts, even if they appear to be a little different, because there were no aircraft, of course, in the Paleolithic. But it's not that. It's what happens, what's done with the aircraft, what happens with the crew, what happens with the wider group recognition and understanding, the status that comes from being recognized as a warrior. That's the fundamental underlying thing that moves between the different cultural and historical representations down the ages. So it is a bad thing. It can be handled. It was handled even in our generation under the pressure of the shadow of World War II, where we were all expected to understand and remember what had happened to them, to their generation. And they were the toys that we were given to play with. They were the movies that we were told we should watch. They were the attitudes that we were told we should have in a patriotic sense towards territory and nation state. Now, that can be seen to be far right, but the far left so-called acts in exactly the same way. They just configure the surface structure slightly differently. But what's powering them is the same, as I say. It has to do basically with territoriality, aggression, rights, reproductive rights, and then hierarchical, Darwinian, adaptive, selective pressures. That's there with the left as well. Unfortunately, there was nothing non-militaristic about the far left after World War II. The Soviet Union, China, the Warsaw Pact countries in Europe, some of whom have simply changed the political mask, but the drives are identical to what they were before. So at an individual level, then, we need to be able to understand how instinct impacts us individually set against the background in a figure-to-ground sense of our culture and of the historical times in which we live. Then we will see what Jungians believe they're seeing when they talk about archetypes. We will see these repeating patterns that don't go away, but that take on representational forms. So this really is the actual beginning of the story if we start in contemporary times. The first representational image we used, of course, was a kind of meeting of a contemporary man with his remote Paleolithic ancestor, and an understanding between them that although the external culture and the times have changed apparently dramatically, deep down the similarities bond them far more than anything else could separate them. And if we're going to work as therapists with people who are damaged at an instinctive level, then we need to know how to work with those images. And if we work with military or police officers or anybody who's been through post-traumatic stress disorder that's involved instincts, And mostly they do. Even OCD involves the frustration of instinct. I'll just say that as a statement, which we could work on specifically in another video. It's so fundamental, the understanding or misunderstanding of instinct and how instincts compensate for our misunderstanding of them, and how some of those compensations are neurotic in a maladaptive way. So it's very, very important that we understand this going forward. So I will pause there and ask for any feedback or questions anyone would like to give. I'll throw it open. If we're okay on that, we can move on. Okay, I'll take it that we're fine. Let's move on. Here's that crucial relationship that I was mentioning earlier. If it goes right, then that young boy and his bow and arrow in the forest, where he's been praying, where he's been acting out his ancestral psyche and his relationship to that natural environment, that will be nurtured sufficiently to meet the instinctive pressure from the past and also adapt in the present by having a proper relationship to his father. The example we gave from our extended family, though, was the opposite of that. Even though, as I say, the father in question had all these militaristic fantasies to compensate for the fact that he'd never done it himself. And he knew that. He knew. It wasn't as if he was so far gone, so mentally ill, that he actually believed his fantasies. But he acted as if he did. And he represented them, particularly to people who didn't know him and didn't know his background. And he was able, it seems, to hold that and at the same time repress his son's natural instincts and development. But what we're showing here is more of an idealized state that can still go wrong. The ideal can still go wrong, whereby a father is with his son in a natural environment, is receptive of those meta instincts and helping him to prepare to become an adult male human being in the contemporary world. So he would literally have his feet on the ground that his ancestors trod, and which, as Jung himself said, contains the psyche, the collective psyche of his ancestors in the very soil itself. Moving on. Once a father's done his first bit of confirming a son to be a man like him in waiting, then the preparation, the instinctive rehearsal, meta-instinctive rehearsal, shifts to the peer group. And here we have the representation of a peer group, and instead of toy guns here, we've got a stick. That engagement is really important. Some things are rehearsed at this level, which allow engagement with the role of being in the military. It makes it possible. And some of those things involve sacrifice. In a game of war, set in whatever time period, fantasy time period that young boys engage with, very often a young boy will act out dying for his comrades. But of course, then he gets up again. He's reborn. There's a rebirth there. That's part of the hero cycle, as anybody who's ever been exposed to Joseph Campbell's work will understand. There's an acting out of that. And for that, he will receive confirmation from his peer group. There is a preparation, a rehearsal for making a sacrifice as an adult, where the death is real and there is no rebirth afterwards. There's the genome accepting at an individual level of the young boy who goes through that, who acts that out in play, to say that you may have to do this for real. So that the people who are related to you, that have your gene pool in common, then you will be making a sacrifice for them. So some of your genes will carry on. They will survive. Sometimes such a sacrifice is necessary. And when boys act that out, they feel good. They get a massive hormonal hit on the confirmation that they feel on the inside, and they receive also from their peer group. It makes no sense outside of that context, other than to say it's just boys being boys, it's just play, it's just fantasy. It means nothing. If we move into ethology, which is the domain that Anthony Stevens moved into in order to get a better understanding of Jung, then we can see play as being exactly that, the rehearsal for the release of the biogrammar of the species. In other words, that which is latent within the genome. But when people don't recognize that and don't understand it, or they dismiss it, and that's a bad thing. And when contemporary young boys start to play video games obsessively to the point where there is no peer group other than the ones that are virtual or online, there's a great problem with that, because although it's almost, in terms of how the brain might react, the same, it is not how the brain reacts or the genome reacts to the actual act of playing and being confirmed with peers in a natural environment. It is not exactly the same, but it can replace it. It can replace it enough to fail and then to cause more instinctive pressure to emerge from within the young person to play more games in order then to try somehow to capture that which is missing. But of course, it doesn't work. And this is an element of OCD with all the rituals that OCD sufferers suffer from, including their obsessional thoughts and their fantasies. There is always some kind of misdirected and frustrated instinct, meta-instinct that's in the background. And the obsessive playing of video games is just an extension of that, but unfortunately one which is so powerful that it's almost like a dream or a reverie, but it certainly lacks the social aspect of learning. And the result of being addictive to video games is a schizoid withdrawal. That's to say, an inability to relate to reality at a social level, and also to put the representation we have of ourselves, our self-concept and self-image, into a real social context. But what happens is that the satiation of fundamental Freudian instincts through violence, aggression, territoriality, dominance, and what have you, they're all amplified and acted out in a virtual way. But the virtual way does not satisfy. This representation on the screen does satisfy enough, and always has, for this to allow that transition from childhood into adolescence and adulthood. Of course, we need to remember that for most of history, boys reaching adolescence were expected to take part in military campaigns. There would be people fighting age 11 and 12. Unfortunately, that's not that often these days, but it does happen in extreme civil war situations. It's going on in the Middle East. It's going on in Eastern Europe. And it could go on in a different way, well, the same way, but in a slightly different adjusted context in the West. If there is a civilizational collapse, then this will start to happen. The gang culture, particularly in the USA involving firearms, is such that you have armed warriors of that age with automatic weapons. And insofar as they are contained within themselves and between themselves hierarchically, with a degree of criminality being the representation of Darwin, then it's satisfied enough not for it yet to bring about the civilizational collapse. But if those males of the same age and older, who would otherwise go into law enforcement, the National Guard, the military in the US, if they are suppressed, then they either have to join the criminal gangs or they have to self-neuter. Neither of those outcomes is good for culture or for civilization, but Darwin will allow it to happen. That's the lesson of history. So we need to be able to handle this transition phase for young boys properly. That's a great cost if it's not done properly. And we need to understand why it's being directed in the way that it is, why there's been the so-called feminization of young boys and of culture, and why it's become so hard, why it's become the very fascism that they say that they are against. It's a catabolic decline. I'll use the term, it's a shit test on a species-wide level that's taken root, at least for now, in the West. So it's that important. And we can't shy away from that responsibility. Even people my age can't. There's no point people in our generation putting their feet up and, just waiting for the end. Because nothing that we've lived for then would have ever been able to survive our time. And Darwin does agree that there should be things that survive. Darwin does agree that where culture is positive, it should be nurtured. But metaphorically, he also agrees that if we won't do it, then Darwin will take out the shears, which in former times have been represented as being the responsibility of women, for example, as the fates, who would cut the thread of life of an individual or a culture. Interesting, isn't it, that the idea of women having that power to end the world, to end the life of an individual or of a culture, was gifted to them. Lots of reasons why that should be the case, but that's what we see laid down in the archaeology of culture, and therefore within the collective psyche. So I'll pause there, and again, throw it open if anybody would like to comment on anything so far, or ask any question which might be tangential to that. We okay?
Let me just make one quick point to see before you move on. We used to know a male social worker.
Oh yeah.
Who I would have to say, certainly in terms of the way he lived his life, was probably a male feminist. And he would actually go out into the street with water guns, and he would shoot other people's little boys in the groin with the big water gun.
Yeah.
And, it's just another example really of what happens when instincts aren't allowed to run properly.
Yes.
You get sexual perversions, if you like that coming through as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you would have to say, I think reasonable person would say that is inappropriate
Yeah.
for an adult male in his position professionally to be doing that kind of thing. But it's just another example of what happens if you repress instinct. And his wife was domineering as well, in the same way that you described my family members earlier, my sister and her husband. It was a similar kind of dynamic between the husband and the wife, and he was so under the thumb that he would go out and he would do that kind of thing in the street to other people's children.
Yeah.
Again, it's just another example. It's just another lesson about what happens if we don't allow instincts to run properly. And women certainly try to feminize men in the way that they have done over recent decades. So I just thought I would add that to the mix.
Thank you. We're not going into too much depth. The wife, was very interested in little boys.
Indeed.
She had children, both of whom were daughters.
Yeah.
But she would acquire other people's children to babysit and would enjoy bathing them. And he would go in there with her. So there you go. Now, even if the corruption of instinct was innate in those two, rather than it being cultural, we can see the dangers of not having a proper boundary or set of identities which differentiated out what was appropriate, what wasn't. And of course, right now, we're seeing an explosion in that kind of thing as well, which is independent of politics. The left and the right seem to be involved in promoting this stuff as well. That kind of perversion, again, that Freud discovered, uncovered, and then was forced to deny.
Yeah.
But history has shown that he was right. Yeah. Sad, but there you go.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're happy on that one. Okay, John, so you wanted to raise a point or ask a question to do with this slide?
Yes. The first thing that came to mind when I saw this card is the Author Voice YouTube channel. It's a channel of father playing in the wildlife with their son, and is having a lot of popularity nowadays. Like in the last couple of years, young men are finding very attractive that kind of videos. So a lot of young men are searching for that different wildlife things that they could do with their father, but they never did. So we can see that representation also in the popularity of different YouTube channels. And that reminded me of that with that card that came to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for raising that. It's a contemporary compensation, and isn't it? At least for some people, with regard to what they're going through. But that transmission has to be the right one. It's not just the involvement. That's what I was saying. You know, this other guy was involved, wasn't he? Your nephew's
Oh, yeah.
father. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was involved. It was just in the wrong way.
Oh, very involved, actually,
Yeah.
in the child's care as he was growing up. But like you say, it was not what he needed from a father. So in that sense, it wasn't fit for purpose.
No.
It caused terrible problems, terrible suffering for that young man growing up. So yes, just involvement itself is not enough, as you say, Stu. It's got to be something that brings on male meta instincts.
Yeah. The father's got to be able to represent
Yes,
him
he has.
sufficiently
Yeah.
in the peer group as well. But thank you for that, though, because that is a very important factor which is obviously active in the culture at the moment. Thank you, Jon.
Mm.
Okay, is there anything else anybody would like to offer before we move on? So the intentionality of this as a representation is to say that the representation itself is like a far memory, because it is a memory. It's not a personal one. This is not something that this young boy has gone through, but it's something which the genome understands as its memory. When, for example, we say that meta instincts are the dreams of the genome, which again we'll come to later, that is the understanding representation that the genome has. So we're not saying that the young boy has these kinds of fantasies, but given an opportunity to experience them, a lot of young boys link with this very, very quickly. An understanding of paleontology, paleoanthropology, even our own son did this. When he was in single figures, he was being taught by a Harvard PhD.
Yeah.
Dr. Laura Bishop, who was in Liverpool at the time. And Gareth was so interested in the Paleolithic psyche and in human evolution that he ended up working in Liverpool World Museum as a demonstrator. And again, he was about 9 years old, and he was making all sorts of clay skulls and things, and it was so accurate the museum took them on and still has them. So although that represents him, beyond that personal collapse, there is the latent far memory which activated in him at a personal level, which he had no direct experience of, but was pulled towards in order to understand. So again, this is important. These things are real. Again, I'll pause. Does anybody like to offer anything or ask anything? Are we okay? I'm moving on. When this boy then becomes conscious of the meaning of the games that he was playing, the role of his father, who could have been in the military himself, then he begins to anticipate himself in the future. And behind him, we have the representations of both Plato and Darwin, because this, for him at this time of life, would satisfy both of them. He would be in a role and a representation that's understood by the genome and is understood by Plato. So the future projection of himself that he first met in his father and then rehearsed through his peers is now beginning to become real. Hence he's still carrying his bow and arrow symbolically, because that's the first thing that linked him to that ancestral Paleolithic past and to the echoes of it that are instantiating in his developing mind now. I'm moving on. Well, once he reaches maturity, then Meta-Instinctive Release rather than rehearsal. And in this narrative representation, he's done that. He's joined the US Army, which has within that image all sorts of things represented. There's a peer group, there's a dominance hierarchy, there's the flag as well. There's obviously a fortified encampment, military encampment. There's a vehicle there over his left on the right of the picture, which is a purposeful military context vehicle. Over on the left, there are vehicles which could be ordinary. They could be the vehicle that's used to access the base when he's on leave or before he first arrives. So there's a lot in that picture. And that is the Meta-Instinctive Release. And he's prepared now for or as prepared as he can be for what he's about to meet. Then moving on. Then there's the reality, which is different than the rehearsal. And in this narrative representation, then it's a dissociative trauma. He's witnessed something which is shocking. Maybe he's witnessed lots of things, but that will be probably his colleague who's dying on the floor. Perhaps he's already dead. Perhaps it's a bullet or a blast which should have taken him, but it took his friend instead. And this is a really important thing to understand when working with military guys who've been through situations like this. There's an immediate division and a split at a Darwinian level. In other words, he wasn't killed, but there are meta instincts that say you didn't offer yourself up in sacrifice for your friend, for your colleague. And it's like, it should have been me. I'm glad it wasn't. Guilt, dissociative split. It might be me next time. Why am I even doing this? Why am I here? All of these questions. And that split then will become part of a loop, which is familiar to people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, where there's the repetition, there are dreams, there are fantasies, there are physical symptoms, there are psychosocial consequences, a collapse in relating, because the meta instincts themselves are in conflict and he's been split off from them. And I say this is usually where people become aware of the problem. Obviously, when it becomes so obvious that they've been cut off from something that they haven't been adequately prepared for, that they're unable to go through it, they're unable to carry on any further. He has the 1,000-yard stare. Eyes that have seen too much. But there are also eyes that look back inside his mind and his brain, down through his genome, and the sacrifices that were made before him as well, by others, that he has identified with in spirit, we could say, at a transpersonal level, where he will feel judged by them. That he didn't sacrifice himself, he didn't save his friend. He felt fear. Does that make him a coward? All of these conflicting emotions and therefore instincts, Panksapian and Meta, collide within the ego of a young man, a brave young man, who suddenly cannot accommodate the conflict between all of them. And the response is to dissociate in a way that Piaget understood better than Freud, better than Jung. This is a hypnotic state. This is an altered state of consciousness brought about by a shock which refers itself to the judgments of his genome. That's a hell of a thing to be judged by. But at the same time, the genome offers the opposite. He should have survived. He should be glad that it was him and not you. And what steps in the gap? Freud's superego, or the moral complex of Anthony Stevens, to start to make judgments. And that's infantilizing because it was laid down as a child. The judgment was laid down. And then the moral complex of the superego itself divides within itself. It polarizes in the way that Jungians are so fond of. And then the sufferer can't even access that as a healing experience because it's critical on both sides of itself. At the level of learning, of social adaptation, and also deeper still than that, the level of Panksepian and meta-instincts. The division is profound. It goes all the way from the outside in to a sense of identity. So we'll move on from there. So what we have here again is the 1,000-yard stare. And over on the left, under the watchful gaze of Plato and Darwin, we have him as a very young boy preparing for just this kind of event, but not understanding really consciously in any kind of experiential, personal level what that actually means. But the instincts, as processed through Darwin, won't really care. It's part of the selective pressure to put people into situations where they may be selected for or selected against. But at a fundamental level, from the perspective of Darwin, then this has to happen. People, young men, usually have to go through this selective pressure. And so there is some preparation, but it's incomplete. The rehearsal, the play of children, rehearsing the dreams of the genome, can't really prepare for actual death and loss. It can only do it in that Jungian fantastical way of an imaginal death and then a rebirth, which gets carried forward from that into the fantasies of adults who have never been in situations like this. And then they go to Joseph Campbell and they talk about the hero cycle. No, you've never done it, have you? You've never been there. So the representation of your meta-instincts and instincts is virtual through what becomes ultimately a cognitive fantasy. It becomes a cognitive fantasy when it's only academic. It's literally that abstract from reality for them. But it's very satisfying at a cognitive level because it is a fantasy holding space for an adult to rehearse things that he did not properly act out. And the hidden aspect of that is the regression to childhood and the reliance on fantasy. But you can't do that with a soldier who's been through it and been traumatized, or a police officer, or anyone who has had a deep enough experience of life and death, or the threat of it in themselves or others, but has been separated from everything other than themselves, but they've had no power over a situation. So post-traumatic stress disorder can run in a similar way through all of those different aspects. But what happens to a soldier who has been trained and goes through this? What it shows us is that the training is never complete enough. The training has to be general enough to be able to scoop enough people in to meet the numerical needs for a culture or a civilization for having warriors. But there will be a high failure rate, there will be casualties. And some of those casualties will take on a post-traumatic stress disorder configuration. But who failed here? Did the meta-instincts fail? Did the young man fail? Did the father fail? Did the peer group fail? Training? It'll be some configuration of all of those. But he's left with that dissociation. The representation of himself sitting on the ground with his weapon, face in hands, that's the point of collapse. The difference between the young boy with the bow and his smiling, happy face, feeling the hormonal and the gene expression kick of doing something that links him to his ancestral past. And then what happened when he was ultimately tested results in that figure on the right with his 1,000-yard stare. While Plato and Darwin impassively look on, because the test isn't over. The test is can he recover? And in what way? There are soldiers, police officers and others who go through situations like this who can go back. They can return to duty. There are others who can't. Now, the ones who do go back, some of them are permanently scarred because they don't get the help that they need, but they can return sufficiently in order to return to duty. And the post-traumatic stress disorder then turns up later when they leave the military, when they adapt to the other meta-instinctive requirements and anticipations of life, such as forming a family and a lifelong relationship, to nurture a family, to adapt to civilian life. It may be then that it turns up. Or the soldier may go back and adapt sufficiently to be put back in a situation like that, and he either survives or he doesn't. Darwin rolls the dice. But for those who suffer in this way, what's next? What does he need to do? And what kind of help does he need to do it? Well, we can move on. There's usually a period of a sense of defeat, which is a kind of bereavement of the self-image that's been lost. The break in the continuity of the self-concept that we discussed in the last couple of videos. So when he looks inside himself, he no longer sees the soldier in the mirror. He sees what he is in the moment. And what he is in the moment contradicts the continuity of his self-concept, but also, in his view, if he's sufficiently injured by his experience, his understanding of his genome and of his instincts, which causes him to separate from them and from their ability to heal him. So at this point, what are we looking at? We're looking at Jungian archetypes, in the sense that archetypes are a contracted form of meta-instincts and of Panksepian instincts and of the genome and the expression of the genome through the lifespan. They are a contraction of them into a virtual concept, which we find represented in the culture, including in Jungian psychology. So they become a split off representation that mediates between the complex field of the sufferer and the genome. And at that point, they can become a fantasy and to some extent a useful one, because it keeps the person held in a holding space. It gives them an alibi, if you like, without judgment. I use the term alibi. I use that in an Adlerian sense. But that protects them from the anxiety to some extent, insofar as they can believe in it. So there might be representations, fantasies, which take on the form that Jungians would call complex archetypes from their perspective. Complexes are definitely there. Instincts are definitely there. Meta-instincts are definitely there. Superpositioning of all of these factors, definitely there. There is also something called a deep structure complex, which we've discussed before, and we can come on to them in a moment. But that sense of defeat is a bereavement, the loss of status, the loss of self, the loss of identity in someone who has survived when they believed that they shouldn't have done or didn't deserve to. You think about that, that's a fundamental separation of identity, a split within them. That's a profound neurosis caused by a shock, but a shock which is understood at the deepest level of our being. It's not a simple neurotic dissociation. It's much deeper than that. It's more profound, which is why so many of these sufferers eventually, if they're not helped properly, end up with self-harm. The self-harm seems, from within the state of suffering that they're in, to be a solution. Right, so we're moving on. In our experience, this is what we need to do. Inner work. And that inner work has to be very, very different from the usual kind of trauma therapy that's out there, including the variants on mindfulness and CBT. They're very popular with academic psychologists. This is an inner work which utilizes what happened as a mechanism or a process within the dissociative trauma, but not in such a way that they have to re-experience the trauma. In fact, we do everything we can to not allow or give the opportunity for somebody to re-experience a trauma. This is not about re-traumatization. It is not about the original Freudian abreactive or cathartic method of releasing emotion to do with a trauma, you will get a temporary relief based on the shifting of energy and information within the psyche and the soma, and even the relationships of an individual's field. But it just fills up again. It just comes back. And depending on the health status of an individual, abreaction can be extremely dangerous. All of that needs to be taken into consideration. And when it is, then what we should do is start with this fundamental observation. The trauma was caused by dissociation. Therefore, the person is dissociable. We all are anyway. But it's important to understand that they are dissociable. That the original trauma was a shock that overwhelmed homeostasis. Homeostasis is that which is all invariant scales of the representational field of a human being, manages their experience and the tolerances of experiences. But homeostasis, as I say, in this kind of traumatic situation, was overwhelmed. So if we're going to use dissociation, that means we don't overwhelm them. We don't overwhelm the ego, and we don't overwhelm homeostasis. In fact, we go with homeostasis. We access it through dissociation. The dissociation has to be a separation of the individual's immediate experience from the symptoms of the post-traumatic stress disorder, something that they generally believe is not possible until they experience it. Once that dissociation is achieved, they are disconnected from the field of the complex involved. So the affect, the fear, the repetition compulsion, etc., is no longer attached to the ego. The ego doesn't feel it. That is such a relief when that happens to someone who is in this state. Your approach then must be non-authoritarian, indirect, and permissive. By permissive, I mean in this context, permissive of homeostasis, reassuming its proper role in the life of the sufferer. When homeostasis is overwhelmed and a complex is generated, the complex then filters and distorts the attempts of homeostasis to correct the situation. And as a result, then that complex fiercely defends itself. And because it can intercept emotion, it can intercept correction by homeostasis, it can intercept meta-instincts and gene expression, this is the complex, all of those can be appropriated to its field. And because its field is identified with by the ego, then the ego goes along with the complex in this form of dissociative self-harm. So our task is to separate off the ego from its complex. And then they don't feel it anymore. They feel differently. And that is the biggest contradiction that a sufferer can ever have. It's not when they think differently. That's relatively easy to do because it's a virtual thing. It's not real. But when people feel differently, that is proof that they can. It's what people fear in a neurosis anyway, that their feelings will suddenly change. So to mobilize thoughts against those feelings is to attempt to override the natural mechanism of association to emotion or affect out of fear. Fear is a Panksepian drive state. And once fear only understands itself from within the context of a trauma, then fear will immediately, that is to say, Panksepp, boot up a representation of that trauma to confirm itself, to confirm its state. But fear has, because it's a Panksepian drive, it has a need for a context, which is meta-instinctive. And we have within us meta-instincts that recognize and understand what fear is and the latent meaning behind fear, which is the ground state out of which the complex organizes itself through trauma anyway. So we need a different meta-instinct. The ego needs to experience it. it needs to understand that there are other emotions, there are other drive states, there are other configurations other than fear. As I say, fear always confirms itself because at one level it's protective. It's about avoidance. Avoidance of what? Well, it will provide you with a representation of that. And there is the defensive meta-instinctive representation of what the person has been through that could have been fatal, and perhaps his guilt complex, which is an element of the trauma, would suggest to him that you should feel guilt, you should have died. Not your friend, you. That bullet shouldn't have missed. I should have got you. And perhaps you should put yourself in a situation where it will get you. And if no one else will do it for you, perhaps you'll do it for yourself. You see where this is going? This is what these things are like. Once they set up, they split off, they become autonomous. It's so important to separate the ego of a sufferer off from anything like that that is destructive and to get them to feel differently. As the dissociation through inner work involving natural trance states, which are healing, then the person doesn't just feel differently. The contradictory meta-instinct to the destructive one will start to represent itself as a future anticipation of how their life can continue. And the great thing about that is that once the ego accesses that, then the positive instinctive pressure ramps up because the ego is in a state to receive it. We can only do this by building the vessel appropriately to receive it. So that inner work has to involve that. And it is something of a journey, but initially, at least, we have to set up the experiences that the ego needs to have of itself as not being in a traumatized state and not identifying with Panxapian drives like fear and rage, because rage can turn on the self as well. It's not just rage against other people. We can go through self-harm that way very easily, but it's just a slight adjustment of understanding, which complexes are very adept at doing. So accessing a different meta-instinct and different Panxapian drives that find their context appropriately, that is the biggest contradiction that a person can have to a post-traumatic stress disorder complex. So we'll just move on one more and then I'll pause for a while for feedback. This is where everything is actually happening and where most of the time we're not aware of what is happening. And this boils down to one of the fundamentals of our model of practice, waveforms of consciousness. So here we have the representative of an individual who's going inside, hence he appears to be in a meditative state. You don't have to adopt that posture. You can do it lying down. You can do it sitting down. You can even do it standing up once you've been entrained how to do it. But going from left to right, the waveforms passing through his head, subjective waveform of personal infodynamic consciousness. As you'll know from previous videos, this includes the Miller number and includes the self-image and the self-concept. It's whatever we can be conscious of at the moment. And beyond that, on the other side, is the field of the extended subjective mind. This goes out into the psychosocial environment. It goes out beyond just that at the immediate level, but as far as it can be extended. And the limit point of that is literally the limit point of our engagement of understanding of how far we are in contact with an extended environment. So it will include our culture. It will include politicians too, and their representations. All of that on the right-hand side and all of that on the left-hand side can merge together dynamically. And if there is a post-traumatic stress disorder complex, then everything gets appropriated to that. And the person is stuck under normal conditions. So how do we get out of that? We need to move into what's in the upper right there. The objective waveform of Platonic field infodynamic consciousness. In other words, that's everything that is not subjective. And for an individual psychology, that's anything beyond his ego field. And that's in what the Jungians think of as being the personal and collective unconscious. It's also in biology. It's in the so-called non-living, non-conscious, inner physical properties of matter that are anything but unconscious. It's in all of the field states that exist simultaneously in this universe, and it's in the original Platonic informational monism field that initiated the development of this universal field that we occupy. Now, it's a big statement, but there's an awful lot of evidence to show that it's actually the truth. Michael Levin's work in biology is moving in that direction. Any kind of transpersonal, transcendental state that the East, through its various cultures, over historical and prehistoric timelines, everything that they do to do with meditation and understanding what we would call psychology on the inside is also aspects of the collapse of the objective waveform potentially into the subjective, how to access things that are beyond ourselves. So our complexes then actually cross over from left to right here. They're within our subjective waveform and they go out into the extended field of the subjective mind. Even though they are conscious unto themselves, insofar as those that are not ego-identified with or are aligned or non-aligned also have a foot, if you like, metaphorically in the objective waveform as well, which is why they can interfere with it. The ego tends to collapse into itself. That's a product of its evolution. Complexes can be limited to what the ego knows or understands, particularly if they are identified with. And as we discussed before, that's a great way of dealing with them, is to entrap them within a particular state and then separate from them. Complexes that exist in other states, such as alignment or non-alignment, and follow the line of the extended subjective mind into the objective, then they need to be dealt with differently. But they can be, because the solution to them exists within the objective anyway. It's just a case of how that is accessed. And again, we would say that this is through altered states of consciousness. So as promised, I'll pause there and see if anybody has anything they'd like to raise or any questions they'd like to ask, or would you want to make a...
No,
You're okay for now, yeah? Okay, so throwing it open, guys, if anyone would like to raise anything at this stage.
Yeah, Steve, and hi, Steve and Pauline.
Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, so you were focusing here on working with identified with complexes through hypnosis. And I assume that once we do that, once we separate those complexes from the ego and the ego experiences them as separate, they transition into alignment, basically.
Yeah.
So that's what we're hoping anyways to achieve, right? To move them into alignment and then to deal with them. Or are they sometimes dealt with without the ego's noticing of dissociation from them? How much is here the ego in focus?
Great questions, Martin. Great questions. So an aligned complex is easier to deal with than an unidentified with one. That's a fundamental principle, because when we identify with a complex, there's no separation. So our own psychological immune system is compromised by them, by the identified with ones. Under more usual neurotic conditions, an aligned complex is an irritant that we know is there. It interferes with our life. It can even generate physical symptoms and psychosocial issues, but we know it's not us fundamentally. So once we separate a trauma so that it's not identified with, that is to say, the traumatic complex is not ego-identified with, but is ego-aligned, then we change its energy and we change its capacity to distribute itself. Excuse me a moment. Because distance has been created. Once distance has been created, we can bring all sorts of things online to deal with it in its aligned state, but eventually shift it into flattening out, into long-term memory where it becomes inert. In other words, we don't need to forget because there's no energy in it. There's nothing there. And that even remembering it, this is under ideal conditions, even remembering in a cognitive way, I once had that trauma, is not sufficient to boot up a non-aligned complex into an aligned or an identified with state, because it has no innate energy within itself to move itself into a different configuration. It is simply not something that we identify with, and it's been dealt with. But we have to create the conditions where this transition is possible. And as I say, because all complexes fall under conditions of dissociation following Jungian principles, then the therapy for them should follow the same route. So once it moves into alignment, that creates a space within the ego that can then receive something else. So part of the process then is, while the complexes move from identification into alignment, then another meta-instinct, which contradicts those meta-instincts that were brought into identification with by the complex when it was identified with, can't get in either. But something else can come in. A new kind of adaptation to the genome, to the timeline, and to the ancestral psyche. So that's basically what happens. Once we can move it into alignment, that creates space for other meta-instinctive representations that the ego can identify with and accept as being itself, that are positive and healing. So that is the progression on from here.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it works with all conditions, if you like, all configurations that complexes can adopt. An aligned complex is far easier to deal with. And you'll find that with people who suffer from them, that they're in nothing like the state of distress that someone is who cannot separate from their identification by using their own resources. So we need to help them to use their own resources by opening up that part of them, which is the non-ego, to deliver the right kind of meaning and understanding to them.
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on. So this is the instinct field then. We've been talking about this, about Panksepian instincts and meta-instincts. The Panksepian instincts, as you guys know, were named after Jaak Panksepp, the late Professor Jaak Panksepp of affective or emotional neuroscience, who was also connected with the founding of neuropsychoanalysis and was a big influence on Professor Mark Solms, the founder of neuropsychoanalysis, who was a neuropsychologist, still is, and Freudian psychoanalyst. So what Jaak Panksepp found is that there are, broadly speaking, although he did say that there were more, but broadly speaking, 7 basic emotional systems, which he said, quite apart from being emotions, were conscious unto themselves and were in essence instinctive. Hence they are instincts and emotional systems simultaneously. We have them, and we have them in common with every species that shares a similar brain structure, particularly brain stem and limbic system, that we do. These are so highly conserved that they boot up automatically. And the leading one is seeking, the one on the top line there of Panksepian instincts on the left. And seeking basically is the drive to act in the world, to meet resources that will satisfy our internal homeostasis. So seeking comes online to compel us to find things that will satisfy what our internal homeostatic needs require. I mean, that can be anything from water, if we're dehydrated, to food, and anything else like that. We are compelled to find it. But it goes beyond those rather simple things, basic elements, into far more complex social and environmental interactions, at which point Panksepian instincts need a context to understand those drives. And we propose that they are meta-instincts because they are whole scenarios, whole understandings of situations, and that these meta-instincts fundamentally comprise of the ancestral psyche, what Jung understood as archetypes. We don't separate instinct and archetype off. Jung did, we don't. And then time-released genomic anticipations. This is where the rehearsals come from. This is where our developmental biology is acted out through gene expression. And our psychology, the form that it takes, develops with our biology, and so should our psychosocial adaptation. If all of those things occur properly, then we are about as balanced as we can be adaptively at any point in our lifespan. So once somebody has begun to separate from attachment to identified with complexes, once the complex traumatic one's been shifted into alignment, therefore the meta instincts that have been corrupted by that traumatic complex are now free to reconfigure themselves, and in essence they will appear as being different. They are functionally and representationally, but also other genomic anticipations from the ancestral psyche, other archetypes, if you like, will present themselves that are anticipating other adaptations beyond the conditions under which the post-traumatic stress disorder occurred. And for our young soldier, that will be meta instincts appropriate for someone who survived and is now going to contribute to the world in a different way, other than acting out what it is to be a warrior. What about what it is to be in relationship to someone, to support society and culture? What about what it is to be a father who is not also a soldier but is there for his family? What about self-improvement, individuation? What about all of those? These are things that are beyond the transitory adaptation that it actually is, from a meta-instinctive perspective, to be a warrior, a young warrior who goes out under the compulsion of meta-instincts in the genome to act out in a particular way that may involve self-sacrifice for others. What about individuation? At this point then, we are moving beyond Freud. Even though there is sexual reproduction involved, the meaning of it is different at this point. We're moving beyond Freud, and we're moving through Adler, and we're glimpsing Jung, positive Jung, as potential that can be achieved. When a person feels that there is a realistic experience of that to have, and they don't have to collapse into a loop of repetition compulsion that tries unsuccessfully to re-experience a trauma in the apparent hope that it will be different at some point if I keep thinking about it and keep feeling it and experiencing it. Once they move away from that, then the genome will agree and the time-released genomic anticipations will come online. The status that he got, this young man, as he moved from being a young boy through adolescence and into adulthood, from the idea of being a warrior, is then something which is recorded in the rings of the trunk of his tree of life. And trees grow away. They don't grow backwards. They grow out and away. They record the past. It's all stored in the rings. And those rings and the experience that they represent provide strength for the trunk of the tree of life. So it's important that this young man's tree grows on growing and that he leaves behind the past. Understanding how to communicate what's embedded in those metaphors so it's received is very important, because metaphor can bypass the field of complexes. Complexes typically form out from the developmental stage and the life experience of an individual ego. This is why Janet said they were partitioned subnuclei of consciousness. In other words, they don't drop in out of the future. They don't drop in out of the remote past of our species. That's a different realm. They come about through our adaptation or maladaptation. But they do represent experience that's part of our lifespan development. But when we can properly disidentify from the need to repeat the traumas of the past, we can then open ourselves up to what will be brought into the tree of life through its roots in the earth. And the roots in the earth of the psyche, the ancestral psyche. So the sap can rise and heal, even if those wounds are recorded within the structure of the tree. And when we can communicate that, as I say, through a metaphor, metaphor is huge in its bandwidth. Complexes are not used to that. Complexes are contractions of experience around their focal, nodal, central focus or point. Whereas metaphor is expansive. It's a whole situation. Meta-instincts are whole situations. Therefore, meta-instincts and meta-instincts and metaphor readily combine together productively. The only way a complex can interfere with that is to populate the ego to such an extent that the ego identifies with the complex, and that can shut off the expression of healing meta-instincts. Which is why when we start with this process, we go through a process of disidentification for the ego from them, and then you become open up to the instinctive field as that's released by the genome, and then even the Platonic pressure, which again Michael Levin is talking about, that will bring about the healing and the change that is necessary, as he would say, to learn new competencies, new skills, to do things we couldn't do before. That again contradicts complexes. Complexes are interested in maintaining the past in the present, and a specific version of the past that were the conditions under which the complex formed. And it's not at all interested in anything that contradicts it. So we have to become disinterested in the complex. That is the process of non-attachment. Are you okay on that, Mladen?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add to that before we move on?
Yes, Steve.
Hi, John, go ahead.
Yes. Once the ego is not identified with the complex, and then after seeking needs to, the pansapien instinct seeking needs to find a context, what kind of different methods can we use to reach that point of finding a context? Maybe creativity can be a method that can be used in that situation, or relating also with people can be a good idea.
Yes, absolutely. So if we go to first principles about complexes, they define a context which defines them. And so it's in the interest of a complex to keep the ego within that representational field that defines itself, and it does not separate the ego off from identification with it. That will include any meta-instinct that the complex has corrupted. So it only allows part of that to come through and to be represented. So anything we do that configures differently to the field of the complex contradicts the complex. Now, initially, under usual conditions, the ego will feel anxiety about being anything other than being identified with the complex, because there is a familiarity to it. It's the easy adaptation, actually maladaptation, to go along with that. So the first and absolutely necessary step and stage is to generate an affect-based experience of separation that is positive from the negativity of the field of the complex. And at that point, we can take it in any direction that is necessary that involves an extension of separation. And creativity, for sure, any of the creative methods that we train people in, and any other kind of relationship which is different to being constrained by the field of the complex. That is contradictory to it, and that will bring other things online. But it is so important initially to generate the separation. Otherwise, we are working against the inertia of the identification by the ego with the complex. That's all we ever meet, the repetition of that. So we have to make that separation, and then we can move things on. But ultimately, anything that involves different states of self-configuration are, by definition, altered states of consciousness away from the identified with state of consciousness that the ego had with the traumatic complex. So anything that moves away from that and that can be reinforced. But it's not just like in behavior therapy, external conditioning and reinforcing. It's a superpositioning of an external state which correlates with a positive internal one that itself emerges out from the genome through meta-instincts and says, this is a better place to go. This is a better person to be, a better version of you to be. So yes, you're quite right.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Jon. Anything you'd like to bring you?
No, fine, Steve, I'll let you run through.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else like to offer anything at this stage? Are we okay? Right, move on. So the ancestral psyche, in broad terms, it's layered. And the first thing that we will experience in everyday life is a pulse of affect or emotion. As we say, that affect is the carrier wave of instincts. We can't experience instincts, and I don't mean reflex reactions when I'm talking about instincts. I mean more complicated configurations than only those. We cannot experience instinct without emotion. Emotion is a more fundamental level of consciousness than cognition is. It processes faster, it's more highly conserved. That's the first layer of the ancestral psyche, and it's the layer that neuropsychoanalysis focuses itself upon. But there is another aspect too, and that is the instincts of the emissary of their master, the genome. To misquote McGilchrist, I hope he doesn't mind that, but it is appropriate to say that although instincts are extremely powerful, they are not the primary or first cause in this chain of representations. They deliver to us the intentionality of the genome to self-correct the course of someone's life towards being optimal. So this is very important. And when we work with people, we take them through these different stages, starting with dissociation. When they actually experience the ancestral psyche, it can be so overwhelming because it's emotional in a positive way, not overwhelming negatively. It is different. The quality of affect is different. But when they experience that, it's going to be important for them at the right moments, and not when they're having that initial spike of transpersonal experience, but when we're trying to consolidate that into a cognitive understanding for them. The affect is actually the carrier wave of instinct. Therefore, if you follow it back, you don't just receive, but receiving is the most important thing. Once you receive the positive affect, you need to follow it back from whence it came. And then you see that truly the emotions are the carrier wave of instincts, and instincts are the emissary of the master, the genome. So the genome then is releasing the capacity for this person to adjust and to be different than the way they were before. Because one of the features of all neurosis, but in particular dissociative trauma, is that people collapse into a self-reference, an understanding of themselves that is defined by the complex and its field. It's as if there is nothing outside of that. They can't experience anything that's outside of that. Everything that they do is to confirm the complex. They're trapped in that loop cognition, which is negative. And they fear emotion because it's as if any emotion I feel now is going to be negative. That's partly down to the complex, which filters and distorts the movement of emotion as the carrier wave of instinct, so it gets misrepresented. But it's also partially because of the intrinsic effort of the genome to break through. So the amplitude of emotion that a person fears that they will feel produces what they will self-report as being anxiety, as if anxiety were an emotion. Our view is anxiety is not an emotion. Anxiety is a drive state to which we attribute an emotion or emotions in order to justify why we're feeling it. That's from the perspective of the ego. From the perspective of the genome, it's a drive state pressure to try to get us to stop doing what we're doing. Because we can't talk directly with the genome and have a dialectical conversation. We can have a dialectic, but we can't have a verbally constructed, so-called rational ego style or interpersonal style communication with the genome. That's not how it works. The genome communicates differently through emotional states, through internal representations, and most importantly and fundamentally, through intuition, which is very, very high bandwidth and very dynamic, because intuitions change. They change because they want to, and they change because we react to them. But none of those things are under the control of the ego. Internal spontaneous representations are not there because the ego wants them to be there or has created them. Internally generated spontaneous emotions are not there because the ego wants to have them. Intuition, likewise, is not there because the ego creates it. In all of those cases, the ego receives, but the interpretation is what turns it into something which is unpleasant or something which heals them. And from the perspective of the complex, in order for the complex to survive, the ego must always interpret emotion as anxiety, because that protects the complex. So when we use dissociation, we move people into a state where they don't feel anxiety. They feel something completely different. And the complex has no access to that state, because as I said earlier, it must maintain the state that supports itself. That generates an immediate separation. So the more profound we can make the experience of dissociation from the complex, then the sooner the ego will regain its autonomy and its capacity to communicate with itself so deeply, it's right down at the level of genome expression and the fields of the genome, such as the Sheldrakean and the Platonic. So I hope that went some way towards answering your question there, Jon, as well, because that's a carry on from that. You okay with that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, moving on. This is the most important thing for us to understand. It's less important for the people that we work with to understand at this level, but this is actually quite a simple level. But we don't need to move into it in case it generates a sense of abstraction away from direct experience. But this is actually what's going on. Along the bottom, we have the brain, and we have the DNA, and we also have waveforms of information existing as fields. Now, what we are stating here is that the configuration of a complex is in all of those states simultaneously. It's within the structure of the brain, it's in gene expression, it's also within field states, and how they join together is a form of superpositioning. But the healing factors are beyond that, and in this image they are in the middle layer and the upper layer. The middle layer represents the ancestral psyche and meta-instincts, and their capacity to heal and to adapt, and specifically to adapt to the genome and its anticipations for our lifespan development. But above that, we have the Platonic, that which is upstream even of biology and of the ancestral psyche. And yet, those two are never not there. They're always there. They're always there with the brain. They're always there with our DNA. They're always there with the various informational fields. That's what we mean by superpositioning. But the problem with a complex for the ego is that the complex filters, distorts, actively represses access to both meta-instincts and the Platonic field, which causes the ego to collapse around the complex and identify with it. But the healing is ultimately to be found by accessing meta-instincts and the Platonic. And when we know that these superposition factors are always present, then we realize that it's actually quite simple how to move consciousness, ego consciousness, out from a collapse into itself and into openness to receiving these healing dynamics. So moving on again. Here we have the deep structure complexes that I mentioned earlier and said that we would get to. So we have our young soldier who's working on himself. And then there's a strap of terms: affect, instinct, meta-instinct, and genome, which shows the progression left to right that we must follow. That's also the progression that we normally receive. Gene expression generates its own dreams, meta-instincts, which coalesce into drive states, which are Panksepian instincts, which then become emotions, and then we become cognitively conscious of them. That's at that level. But beyond the ordinary field of complexes, we have deep structure complexes. In this image, that's the rather spectral-looking fellow with the long hair and beard. And such a figure can become the portal to accessing meta-instincts as a deliberate act of consciousness, whereas normally meta-instincts either present themselves because they're not inhibited, or we experience them as transitory, transcendental states. So the deep structure complex then is Janus-faced. It looks towards the ego, and it looks in the opposite direction towards the genome. And it's made up partially of what the ego believes to be the reality of itself and of the world, including its learning. But it also, pardon me, reflects back to us what the genome, pardon the expression, thinks of the ego. In other words, the interpretation of the ego forms one face of the deep structure complex. One of the functions that it serves is actually to prevent an ego which is inappropriately trained and developed from accessing things that could harm not only the ego, but its biology. It's quite possible for the mind to affect the body. It does so all the time, as is the reverse. An ego that is preoccupied with itself won't be doing too much damage in that way. It won't be going where it doesn't understand. It won't be causing effects that it can't understand. But a complex, an ordinary complex, which sits within the ego but also has an extension into the wider complex field and is capable of intersecting meta-instincts, emotions, gene expression, and the like, is something that understands the ego but also understands the wider ecology of the ancestral psyche. So when we separate off from complexes, it's sometimes useful to access a deep structure representation. And the nearest analogue to this is what the Jungians think of as archetypal images on the inside. But there is an important distinction to be made. The archetypal image, which forms a deep structure complex by being borrowed from the culture through the ego's understanding of culture and understanding, say, of a psychological model, will then form a representation that confirms itself on the inside. So that acts as a mirror to keep the ego out. It sees only itself. Or positively, it allows the ego to approach the unconscious and be tested. The test is, can you figure out that this isn't real? This is not the face of the unconscious or non-ego mind. This is a construct which has been provided to reflect you back to you and what you understand about yourself, and also what the non-ego understands about the ego, that prevents you from going further. Someone who is psychotic has broken down this defensive barrier. A psychotic person's homeostasis is gone. They can interfere with representations on the inside. They can also develop distortions, not only as body dysmorphia, they can actually change their physiology in an autonomous way, autonomous to their own understanding of that, as well as their outer relationships. Someone who is in danger of becoming psychotic should have these kinds of representations to protect them and to protect the whole field of the person. But unfortunately, sometimes as psychosis can be a progression, then things that are internalized as beliefs and then turn up as deep structure complexes become part of the field of the psychosis, part of the inner representation of the symptoms. It's one of the things that Jung observed with his colleagues at the Bergholzli, was things that we would call deep structure complexes, but he would definitely call them archetypes. As I said earlier, we don't see any difference between an archetype and its image. If the image is genuine, then there is a connection through superpositioning between its outer cultural representation, its deep structure complex. It's a complex because it's been created. It's unique to the person, perhaps to their lifespan. And it also interfaces, as I say, with the non-ego psyche as an extension of itself. But when we can access healing deep structure complexes, then that tells us that the psyche is in a state of imminent repair, imminent self-repair. But it must not be a fantasy. We mustn't internally project something, like think of Jung's wise old man, and I'll put that in there and I'll talk to it. Don't mean that. I mean something that comes from within to without, spontaneously, because that represents the inner world, as well as what the ego believes in. This is formulated or systematized in Tantrism perfectly. The idea of what we first meet as being wrathful deities, but they're not real. They reflect back to us the state of our own ego, our own consciousness, and our ignorance. We then see that reflected back to us, usually in a wrathful, harmful form, which is frightening. That's Jung's shadow. But at least the Buddhists, the Tantric Buddhists, know it's not real. They know it's a fiction that's been internally projected. They then say, if you relate to this image, these wrathful deities, in the right way, they will convert themselves into positive, healing, helpful deities. They then become what we could call a psychopomp or a port reeve, a doorway guardian to that which is beyond them, which for a Tantric Buddhist is Bodhisattva or Buddha mind. For the Jungian, that would be the self-archetype. For us, it's the Platonic field. But those differences in theoretical representation do not disguise the fact that they are the same thing, a fundamental human level. So once complex has been cleared out the way, we can then receive images which will take on a natural form and not be there because of internal projection. So when we work as a therapist guiding someone through recovery from post-traumatic stress disorder, this will be very important, because the deep structure complex will also morph into a representation of the future potential of this young man, and then will attract the ego towards it rather than frighten it and keep it out. And that's a really important issue. Is there anything, again, Paul, you'd like to?
No, I'll let you mostly say, because those are cards to get through, isn't there?
There's quite a few links, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll move through.
Yeah.
So it's something we need to know about as therapists, and that is something that I've explained before, to do with Jungian typology and Platonic field infodynamics. That Jung's understanding of his model of typology, we suggest, was intuitive principally, just like Plato intuited what Plato called archetypes, and that Jung borrowed. Once it went into Jung's personal context, it took on a different meaning on the surface, but deep down they are the same thing. And what we're saying here is that Jung's model of typology maps directly on to the evolution of the brain and meta-qualia of representation that are real. And that's why Jung could make the intuitive representation that he did, that seems to explain something accurately enough to be real. Now, we need to know what that is. In other words, what the meta-qualia of consciousness are. Our patients and our clients do not need to know that. They may already be informed about Jung, and Jungian typology, in which case we can utilize that. But we need to know what that actually is, beyond only a subjective intuition that Jung had. We need to know how powerful they are at organizing experience, and that the most dominant one of all is intuition, which exists in two states: personal subjective intuition and meta-intuition. Intuition is the bandwidth of the Platonic field itself when it's in its meta state, and that then collapses into personal intuition. And from there, it can move into representation that appears to a Jungian to be thinking or feeling, sensing, or what they think of as being intuition, and then extroversion and introversion. And what we say, it's all of those things at the same time. It's just a case of how conscious we are and what collapse, what configuration it takes. Jungians say, for example, thinking and feeling cannot exist at the same time. We say it does, and manifestly it does. And if you're in communication with someone, it's obvious. In a single sentence, they will move from cognition in analytical thinking terms to a cognition which is feeling-based as Jung understood it. But he said that couldn't happen. They were opposites. And he was determined to separate opposites in that regard. Intuition and sensing occur at the same time because intuition can become sensing. Intuition can become feeling or thinking. Intuition can be extroverted or introverted. It can move through any of those states, and they are all there at the same time. And children exhibit this. They don't differentiate out into a Jungian type in a clear way that the Myers-Briggs personality test would discriminate. Children can be engaged in the reality of the world and superimpose on that an intuitive understanding of the imagination that is latent within them. So they can think and feel simultaneously. They can experience the sensory, external sensing of what's really happening, and then an internal model provided by intuition, which takes them beyond the immediate moment simultaneously. So the Meta-Qualia are superpositioned, and they are always present. But in a state of neurosis, you get a collapse. And many of the Myers-Briggs personality configurations are actually descriptions of neurosis, not adaptation. When you hear, for example, Myers-Briggs people say, oh, Jung was either an INTJ or an INTP, then when I hear this, if I'm in a conversation with a Jungian, I'll say to them, then he never individuated, did he? If he individuated, he was none of those types, but he had access to all of them. You can't be an INTP or an INTJ and individuate. That's a collapse. That's a collapse of the field of awareness into specific meta-qualia that become habitual. And the Myers-Briggs describes, for example, with an INTP, what an INTP is not, according to them, which they call ESFJ. So that means there is a polar opposite for the Jungians, which an INTP doesn't have. So what they do is then perform some kind of alchemical wizardry and suggest that, well, you can work on that through your anima or your shadow. No, what you should do is simply open yourself up to the potential field of meta-qualia experience and representation. And you don't need any of these abstract constructs that get in the way and hold you back and maintain opposition, which is a neurotic division and split in what we understand of the world. So if we work with someone who understands Jungian typology, say who's gone through a trauma, then we need not to be heavy on the theory, but move them into experiences which naturally contradict and correct for the collapsed state of Jungian typology, typically as it's expressed through the Myers-Briggs. So moving on from that, just briefly, we have this one as well, which describes the Meta-Qualia of Consciousness, and we use the Latin terminology for it. But they are all there, always present, always working, but the ego does not use them equally. And when it habituates itself by collapse, then we get a differentiated Jungian type, and that is neurotic and maladapted. And when somebody's been through a trauma, and if they're an INTJ, for example, which has its particular problems, as all the types do, the last thing you want is to keep a person in a state of being an INTJ, but you don't want to turn them into their opposites either, because that brings all sorts of problems in with it too. So it's all about increasing the bandwidth of consciousness, hence these are meta-qualia. Not like Chalmers collapse into specific ones, like there is something that it is like to experience the colour red. The colour red is just the colour red. The context of the colour red is where a meta-qualia and meta-instinctive understanding would come online and immediately increase consciousness and say, are we talking about a red flower? Are we talking about red blood? We're talking about a red traffic light. talking about a red sky at night. What are we talking about? There's no context. So the context provides the bandwidth of Meta-Qualia that tells us far more than a collapse into a single aspect of it could be. And that's important when we're helping people overcome neurosis, because neurosis is all about collapse. This then is the next stage, which is called Anamnesis. That is basically come about through medicine, but it also comes from Plato. It's very popular in the 19th century and until quite recently, really, to talk about anamnesis as the case history. It actually means remembrance, the recall. If you remember the young boy when he was finding himself exposed to ancestral memories coming in when he was in the cave, then when he's an adult, he can do the same thing. But now there are people in there. For the young boy, there was only the cave art. There was only that deep, deep representation without experience to measure it against. But here we have an adult. Even the Platonic field is present in the geometric shapes. But there is a group of people and they are men. And he is a man. And he needs to feel into it. He needs to remember through his genome what it means to be a man beyond being only a warrior. If the world was full of warriors, there'd soon only be one of them left. Be one left standing, and then extinction would follow. But there are other contexts, and it is so important to understand that, even for a young man who has become a warrior because of his meta-instincts. So this is an anamnesis. This is a different kind of far memory that is beginning to coalesce for this young man as a solution, rather than as something which is just an echo in an empty cave from the Paleolithic. This is a living context. Now we have Anabasis. This comes from Xenophon, the Greek. He's an Athenian general, a mercenary leader who was helping a particular king in the Persian Empire to put down a rebellion, and he had 10,000 soldiers with him. But because of the way things were going, which wasn't very good for his sponsor, he had to leave, he had to go, he had to return. That's what an Anabasis means. It means the journey of return. And what we have here then is something emerging in the background. The non-ego of this young soldier is producing a representation of an alternative life that he can have, minus the identification with the trauma. Both Plato and Darwin are welcoming this move because it suits both of them. The approach of the newly adapted, newly distilled out from the ancestral psyche version of the ego is reaching out to the traumatized version of himself. This is the journey back. This is the opposite to Katabasis, which is the collapse. The stage of recovery then is where the traumatized version of the ego goes back. I mean, I know it's going into a tunnel of light. That could also be the trunk of the tree of life. And here we have Plato and Darwin pointing to the outside world, and this is the way to go. This is the future. This is not to negate the past. It's not to say that you didn't do what you did. You were brave. You stood up to the challenge posed by your ancestors. You suffered. Now it's time to move on. And that could be performing another function, which both Darwin and Plato would agree with. A relationship for life, for the reproduction of the species, for the consolidation of culture and the future. Or maybe he was already married, in which case this would be a rebirth of his relationship, because he wouldn't be bringing the trauma into that relationship. Moving on again, this further anticipation, he has a son of his own, who isn't wearing red, he's wearing blue, just as Plato and Darwin do. Innate within the representation of his son should be the far memory of his own experience of those meta-instinctive representations that were in him at that age. He now has the responsibility that his father had. And then finally, the final cause, telos, as in telic. On the left, Plato and Darwin, surrounded by their appropriate fields of accoutrements. On the right, we have Jung and the principle of individuation, which is different for everyone. It was different to him from the perspective of this young man, and vice versa, and to everybody else. That's the main thing about individuation. It is individual, but it emerges out from the collective. We work the root and branch of our own tree of life actively by our engagement with the world and with the process of lifespan development. As he achieves this, he has contradicted the trauma completely. The trauma would have kept him locked in that 1,000-yard stare, schizoid withdrawal, thanatos perhaps too, ultimate form of self-harm. Whereas this is all about the confirmation of the positive direction of life. And this should be our goal when we work with people, is to move them into this state, not because we direct them, but because we assist them to bring this out from themselves. So the victory is theirs. The consolidation, the understanding is theirs. And in a nutshell, rather long nutshell, in a nutshell, that's it. That's how we work with trauma generally, but we've used a specific analogy here to draw that into illustration. Okay, so let's throw it open, guys. See if anybody's got anything to say on this. I appreciate it's been a lot.
Hi, Stephen, Pauline.
Hi, Ben. Not quite.
Anything I don't know about you now. You have to follow all of you.
I've got you.
Okay. I need to step away in a minute or two here, but I did want to affirm how well you've laid out a map for healing for those who have suffered trauma, as opposed to what's available out there, in terms of, I worked with a soldier who, by a previous therapist, had been asked to record the trauma story and listen to it while he was driving or things like that. Oh, then we have, attempts at desensitization, trying to desensitize and exposure therapy and all of it. But, what you've mapped out is a profound map, a wonderful map, of hopeful map for healing, so that, people who have suffered trauma, soldiers, police officer, different ways we get traumatized. I want to commend you both for that.
Thank you, Ben.
And
Yeah, it's quite a journey, and the goal is that the healing emerges out from within the individual.
Yeah.
it does it, again, people are told, PTSD is a permanent state for the rest of your life now. You'll have good days and you'll have bad days. And, when you have good days, don't get too excited because bad days are coming. Bad days, when you have bad days, don't get too down because good days are coming. So, we've made trauma survivors passive to the whole thing. Which contradicts what we were saying at the beginning of today's seminar, the passivity. And so you're along for the ride with PTSD. It's very, very discouraging and disheartening. And so that's why what you've mapped out is it works, and you've seen it heal people, and I hope people listening to this will adopt this and pursue this further in depth, to get themselves healing, or other therapists who would be listening to this, that they have a map on how to help people that come to them with trauma.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. And we know that you're going to do this, and you are doing it with people. You're delivering this through your heart.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Paul, you're going to say?
I was just going to say, it's just been, it's really what Ben has said, that for us in our experience, recapitulation rarely works. And in effect, if you put somebody through a process of recapitulation, the chances are you will re-traumatize them. And it's just as you rightly say, Ben, just an endless cycle of, hoping that there might be some recovery, and then setbacks, and then hopeful again, there might, and so on. And that person, that individual, never reaches a completion point, and then it becomes an artifact of the therapy itself, unfortunately. And we've found that this works, and it works quickly, and when it does, it moves people on. So that they don't have to keep looking back. They don't have to keep re-traumatizing themselves. I mean, even what you just said about the therapist that you knew who suggested that people do this kind of thing when they're driving. I mean, it beggars belief, doesn't it? If that person who is driving completely reconfigures a traumatic state, they could then go on to kill somebody else quite easily. It's astonishing, the kinds of things that are done in the name of therapy, unfortunately. But I mean, thank you so much for your comments. You are a working therapist out there. You know what it's like. You've worked with some very difficult cases yourself, and you are pressure testing some of these methods yourself. As I say, we found them to be effective throughout our career. That's what we do. But then we are unconventional in that regard.
We are.
Or we will be considered to be.
Oh, yeah. We've been directed by feedback right from the beginning. I won't go into it, the recapitulation of trauma can be fatal with vulnerable people. I know you know that through the scientific measurements that occur when you do this, specifically for respiratory psychophysiology, so we know the dangers. And when they were pointed out to us, and we could see them on an ECG machine, as well as on a capnograph, that the silent cardiac ischemia was occurring simply because a mild negative emotion was recorded. And we saw this in Charing Cross Hospital in 1988. And knowing that demanded of us that we find a better way. And the better way, and they used hypnosis at Charing Cross, but unfortunately it was direct and authoritarian, whereas ours never was. That was the ground state. We should cause no harm, no further harm, but that doesn't mean that we're inactive or we just do reflective counseling. We're very active, but minus the harm, and having the faith in homeostasis, which George Engel put in us, and so did Peter Nixon. Those two particularly were saying that is the goal, is to restore health from within to without. That was massively important and has guided our life ever since. But this basically is from trauma to individuation. And it's possible to do that without being stuck. And I say thank you for sharing that, because it is the common experience we know. But to have that reminder gifted in that way as we bring this seminar to an end is to show what the alternative is to doing something like this, which is humanistic. It's awful. It's awful to do that, to re-traumatize. But that is the academic gold standard of people who shouldn't be allowed near anyone who's suffered. It's terrible, but we do our bit, and you and the other guys who are with us, they all do their bit. You've been doing this for over 25 years, which is a great amount of experience, and we know your heart. You're a good man. So what you communicate will be good because of that. because of the fundamentals of your nature, and that is so important. There can be no manualized, following a manual form of psychotherapy. We just can't. That's anti-relational.
Yeah.
You have to start with the character and the personality of an individual and how good their heart is, and you have a good heart. There's no question of that. We know that, and we know that you know that.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, thank you for this. This is such a gift, and being able to have language for a process, and it's not a theoretically heavy, but this is very functional in the sense that it's very practical. It's doable, and it does bring forth healing, and people need not suffer, under these miserable suggestions of, oh, you'll have good days and bad days. What's there to look forward to if we don't have the final cause, the telos of being able to individuate and heal and redeem? It's hopeful. My goodness, I hope people get a hold of this and run with it.
Thank you. Well, they will, Ben, in every life that you touch.
Yeah.
Which is a hell of a burden, I know. And I gladly give it to you. No, you don't need to be given it. You've got it within you. I know that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, I have a patient in about 2 minutes, so if you don't mind,
Of course, yeah.
wait. But thank you again. This is wonderful.
Thank you, Ben. Blessings to you.
Blessings to you as well.
Thank you. Right, so would anybody else like to ask anything before we conclude for today? We're okay. Thank you.
I only wanted to tell you that it's been a good seminar. It's a very good video. I think that it's going to be great. Yeah.
Thank you, Jon.
Thank you, Jon.
That's hugely appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
And thank you to Mladen as well
Yes,
for his
absolutely.
contributions.
Yeah.
No problem. I hope, Steve, that this can become a functional workflow for you with the PowerPoint presentations. I hope they work well.
I'm sure they will.
Well learning.
I'm sure they will. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
So for those of you who can make it, we'll see you Thursday and Sunday, of course, as usual. Thanks so much. And blessings to you all. Take care.
See you soon.